Adam here for PC monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC AG352UCG6. This monitor uses a 35-inch VA panel, or more specifically an AMVA, Advanced Multi-Domain Vertical Alignment panel. It has a 1800R curve, which means it has a fairly steep curve. Just to talk a bit about the curve first, it's something that looks a bit exaggerated in videos, in pictures as well. I mean, if I go up a bit, you can see it has a fairly steep curve. But when you're actually using the monitor, I find you quickly adjust to this curve, and lots of users I've spoken to who've used curved monitors like this before agree. The curve's actually quite a nice thing, especially on a screen that's as wide as this one. It's kind of a subtle addition, it just draws you into the image a bit, but it feels completely natural. It doesn't feel alien or distorted or anything. It's really something that you have to see for yourself, but I do find that most users really quite like the curve, and I quite like it as well. But if you are doing design work or that kind of work with the monitor and you want geometric perfection, then yes, the curve's not exactly ideal for that. The resolution is 3440 by 1440, and this gives you a good amount of desktop real estate. It also keeps things quite readable. The pixel density is quite similar to a 27-inch WQHD or 2560 by 1440 monitor. The 21:9 aspect ratio gives you an advantage when you're playing games in terms of your field of view. I talk more about that in an article on the website, and also a little bit in the written review in the section about the 35-inch 3440 by 1440 experience. So most games use horizontal plus scaling, which means that you basically get more information on the game to the side, whereas vertically you get exactly the same as on a 16:9 screen. So it's basically like looking at a 27-inch screen with extra bits at the side, and it's useful. And the real estate for sort of websites, that kind of thing. But you'll notice a lot of websites actually, you'll just get lots of white space if you just fill the screen with the website. So I tend to prefer to split the screen, and actually if I'm watching a video on Netflix or YouTube or something like that, what I'll often do is make the video as big as I can before black borders kick in at the sides, or before big black borders kick in at the sides. So you can see if I just made that full screen, there's sort of big black borders, that's wasted space as well. So I prefer to just keep those black borders off. The rest of the screen can be filled with a website. Then when I'm at a sort of a boring place on the video, or I'm just sort of want to half pay attention, I'll switch over to the other side and sort of look at something on a website, multitask in that way. But obviously you can have things full screen, and again, this content's not 21:9, so you get the black borders, but there is some movie content, and if you use certain plugins on Chrome, etc., and you'll find that some content does actually fill the screen completely, movie content, and again that's explored in more detail in the article I mentioned before. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the external features of the monitor. The biggest change from the older model is the fact that matte black plastic is used for the bezels rather than glossy black plastic. This is might seem like quite a subtle change, but it does make quite a nice difference. I much prefer the matte bezels. The overall look of the monitor is quite subdued, quite understated, but I find it looks pretty smart. I do prefer the matte bezels to the sort of fingerprint magnet glossy plastics. The side and top bezels are also slightly thinner, just a few millimeters thinner compared to the older model. And the silver stand has been replaced by a powder coated metal black finish, which is sort of has a semi-glossy or semi-matte quality to it. At the bottom either side of the Aegon logo there are some strips of LEDs, and they're explored in the OSD video, so I'm not going to go through them again, but you can set them to red, green or blue, or have them off in the OSD. The main thing from the front is of course the large ultra-wide screen. That uses a light matte anti-glare finish. So you can see, I mean, this is quite a bright room, so you can see they're not exactly sharp reflections, and they're probably exaggerated in the video. Based on what I can see on my camera screen here, they are exaggerated in the video. So it has pretty good glare handling, but it doesn't give an overly grainy look to the image. The included stand allows you to tilt the monitor. You can tilt it a little bit backwards. You can tilt it a very little amount forwards as well. You can also swivel it left slightly and right slightly. The exact measurements of the adjustability, they're included in the written review. You can also adjust the height. And again, the exact measurements and figures in the review for how much you can actually adjust everything. From the side, there's not really an awful lot to talk about. Matte black plastics used extensively. You can also see some silver from this area, which you can see more clearly from the rear of the monitor, which I'll show you shortly. You can see the robust stand design. It is a solid, a weighty stand. It gives a really good solid base to the monitor. And you can also see the curvature of the screen. And again, this appears fairly steep. Once you're actually using the monitor, it's not such an extreme thing really. It's pretty natural. At the rear you can see, again, matte black plastics used extensively, some semi-matte plastics for the powder-coated elements of the stand. Silver, semi-matte plastic, or matte plastic as well, and they have these little, I call them wings, they have these little strips of LEDs, and they're controlled alongside the ones on the bottom bezel with the OSD. And they're explored in the OSD video. The stand attaches by 100 by 100mm VESA. You can, when you actually get the monitor, you have to screw them in. The little screws are included, and you screw this stand in. Or alternatively, you can use an alternative 100 by 100mm VESA stand or mount of your choice instead. There's a little fold-down headphone hook here, retractable little antenna you can hang headphones on, and it just folds neatly away when you're not using it. There's also a Kensington lock slot. Ports are down firing. There is a 3.5mm microphone jack, which is a pink one there, a 3.5mm headphone jack, the black one next to it, two USB 3 ports, the first of which has a yellow coloration, and that supports fast charging, and there's a USB upstream port as well. There's DisplayPort 1.2, which supports NVIDIA G-Sync on compatible GPUs. There's an HDMI port, HDMI 1.4. There's another 3.5mm microphone jack, and then there's a DC power input as well. So that means that there is an external power brick which connects to the mains rather than an internal power converter in the monitor itself. There are also two 2-watt speakers which are up firing, and these just give a basic sound output. I mean, they're pretty low powered, they don't give an amazing sound quality at all, but they're good enough for a sort of backup speaker system or a basic sound output from the monitor. I'm now running Battlefield 1. I'm going to talk a bit about the contrast performance of the monitor. Contrast performance is really the main strength of a VA model such as this. The static contrast on this model I recorded around 2000 to 1, so the static contrast isn't as strong as it is on some VA models. Generally high refresh rate VA models like this, they would have a contrast between around 2000 and 3000 to 1, like this one does. But there are some VA models that have closer to 5000 to 1 or even slightly higher when you actually record the static contrast. So the contrast is by no means extreme for a VA model, and it's actually on the lower end of what you'll see on a VA model. However, it does still give you an edge over other non-VA panel types. With dark scenes such as this, or darker elements of the game, the depth of the dark shades is pretty good. It's certainly beyond what you'd see on non-VA LCD panels. There's a little bit of what I call VA glow. You can see it's sort of a bit lighter towards the bottom of the screen, and also towards the corners, but it's not extreme on this model. And if you compared that to IPS glow that you'd get on a screen of anywhere near this size, you'd see an obvious sort of bloom of IPS glow towards the corners of the screen in particular, and that would really eat away at detail a lot more than you get from this VA glow. And again, as there are some models with stronger contrast, there are also some VA models that have less VA glow than this. In my experience, the curved models tend to have a little bit more VA glow, but I don't consider it extreme at all on this model. So from a sort of reasonable viewing distance, at least from sort of 70 centimetres, which was what I sit from the screen. If you sit closer than that, say 60 centimetres or even closer, then the VA glow becomes more of an issue, or becomes more noticeable, but it really depends on the ambient lighting. So I'm looking at this in a dark room, and it might not capture perfectly on the video, but usually I'd use this monitor in a slightly better lit room than this, and I think most users probably would as well, and you're not really going to notice that kind of issue here. The strong contrast also means that brighter shades, such as the fire there, stand out nicely against darker surroundings. Again, it doesn't have the same kind of pop you might get from a model with much stronger contrast, or even perhaps a glossy screen. I should also mention the screen surface again here is light matte anti-glare, and it has quite a smooth surface texture. So bright elements such as the moon there, bright shades, they don't have a sort of grainy look that some matte screen surfaces would give them. They actually look pretty smooth, so that's good. And again, they do stand out quite nicely. I mean, I've used lots of models of various different panel types, so I'd be able to tell quite quickly that it's a VA panel I'm using here, even if I didn't know, and that's because of the edge of contrast you get compared to other non-VA models. It also helps give a bit more sort of 3D structure. For example, if you look at the wall here, it is sort of a combination of sort of shadowy, detailed areas which have very dark shades and then brighter shades surrounding it for the actual stonework itself. The stronger contrast helps those dark elements really sort of become relatively deep, bright elements standing out nicely, and it gives a kind of 3D structure that non-VA LCD panels don't get. And again, this isn't as extreme as you'd get on models with even stronger contrast, but it certainly is a benefit of using the VA panel. VA models such as this, they also have what's known as black crush, and that means that the shades that are slightly lighter than black but are still very dark, there are plenty of examples of those kind of shades around where my crosshair is, the bush there, they actually appear darker than they should, and they kind of blend together in a sort of black mass, and that's because the perceived gamma is a lot higher on VA models at the point of the screen that you're sort of looking at directly. The perceived gamma reduces towards the edges of the screen, and also if you view it off angle, the perceived gamma changes quite dramatically actually, so you can see a lot more detail visible when you view off angle. You can also see the VA glow bloom out a lot more obviously. That's something I should have really mentioned before, but if you are viewing it off angle, then the VA glow becomes more of an issue. The black crush on this model, it's not too extreme. It's actually quite low, about as low as I've seen on a model of this kind of size, or actually really any VA model for that matter. It does mask some of the more subtle details, but the extreme comparison I'm giving you here in the video, that's actually giving you more detail than there should be. It's not possible to sort of measure the perceived gamma from this kind of angle with a colorimeter. That just looks directly at the middle of the screen, like sort of point blank, and measures there. So it doesn't take into account these sort of viewing angle related differences. But actually the perceived gamma there is probably very low, and the level of detail is much higher than it should be and what the game developers intend. Whereas centrally, there's a bit less detail than there ideally would be. But as I say, it's not extreme, and there's quite decent detail levels, and certainly if you compare that to the detail loss from IPS glow in the regions of a screen affected by that, it's far more minor. And I'm going to talk about colour reproduction, and I like to start this section off by looking at the Lagom text test, and that's on the website lagom.nl. And you can actually see the black crush I was talking about and the perceived gamma behaviour is reflected on this as well. There's a kind of cone in the middle of the screen where the text looks more blended, and surrounding that there's a kind of more colourful striping to the Lagom text, and then it kind of goes to a red colour further out. And if you shift your viewing position, that cone kind of follows you around. Perhaps it's not the best demonstration on the video. I don't know how clear it'll be, but certainly I can see by eye that it shifts. And if you're sitting closer to the monitor, this effect's sort of exaggerated a bit as well. So you can see the Lagom text looking quite blended, sort of where the camera's pointed in the middle of the screen, whereas further out it looks kind of red, and that shifts. This applies to other colours as well. It's not just this Lagom text, there's nothing special about that in terms of it showing these issues and nothing else showing the issues. If you look at solid colours, for example, there's a sort of purple screen fill here. It looks a kind of lilac-y colour in the middle or further up, but there's an obvious border of pink surrounding it, and there's a kind of sheen of pink which moves as you move your head as well. And again, it's related to perceived gamma changes. And you can see that with other colours to a lesser extent. The red on this, for example, it looks kind of burnt pink towards the outside and more of a vibrant red centrally. And that does shift as you move your viewing position. But if you're just sitting normally in front of a screen, the effect does depend on your viewing distance. If you're close to the screen, the effect is more pronounced. There's a loss of saturation further out. Further away from the screen, the effect diminishes. I tend to sit around 70 centimetres from the screen, which I think is quite a reasonable viewing distance. But what does this all mean? Well, I'll run Battlefield 1 and I'll talk a bit more about what this means in practice. I'm now running Battlefield 1 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction on this game. And I'm just using this as an example. Obviously other games, all of this stuff applies as well, but the reason I'm actually using this particular scene on Battlefield 1 is that it's quite a nice scene for showing off some of the things I'd like to talk about. Even though I've got a suit of armour which is actually blocking a lot of the screen, which isn't ideal, but I mean, I've looked at a few sort of different scenes on Battlefield 1 and I feel this one shows off some of the things quite nicely. So overall the image looks rich, it looks natural, it has nice variety, there's some quite nice vibrant looking greens, quite lush looking greens. But really vibrant is quite a relative term. It depends what you're comparing the monitor to. I would say it looks rich and natural, the image. I wouldn't really describe it as particularly vibrant, nor would I describe it as anywhere near looking washed out. I actually use the Dell S2716DG as one of my main gaming monitors, and compared to that, even when the Dell is fully calibrated, the gamma corrected with an ICC profile, all of that stuff, the Dell just doesn't look as rich as this. And then that's with this model just using OSD tweaks and not using any ICC profile at all. There's some pretty decent, fairly rich looking shades. The orange from the flames of the cannon fire, for example, the explosions, really stands out in quite a nice way and has nice good depth to the orange and the yellow shades without looking extreme. The colour gamut of this model, which in a large part dictates the sort of level of vibrancy, if you like, the saturation levels, that is a little bit beyond sRGB, and content such as this is developed with the sRGB colour space in mind, so you get a bit of extra vibrancy from that. This isn't like applying NVIDIA Digital Vibrance or something like that, because all that does is pull shades towards the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself, so that closes up your range of shades, crushes everything together, and it basically makes everything look wrong, cartoonish. You lose a lot of shade variety, you don't get those subtle shade differences, so that's not really a good way of delivering better vibrancy. And also the most saturated shades that the monitor displays is dictated by the colour gamut itself, and using digital vibrancy does not change that. And in terms of digital vibrancy, there's actually, I explained this in the OSD video, but there is something called game colour on this model, and that is basically a digital saturation enhancement function, much like NVIDIA digital vibrancy, but built into the monitor. And for the reasons I've just explained, I would not advise using that. I much prefer the more natural look of that just being disabled or set to 100, which is the neutral position. As I mentioned with Legom, there are some perceived gamma changes and saturation changes. There's a loss of saturation further out at the flanks of the screen, and also lower down to a lesser extent. So shades do look most saturated in the sort of central mass of the screen, and they lose a bit of saturation further out. And this effect does depend on your viewing distance. So I like to view this monitor from around 70 centimeters. It varies a bit depending on how relaxed my posture is and that kind of thing. If you sit quite close to the monitor, the saturation shifts become more pronounced at the edges of the screen. If you sit further out or further back, things become more uniform in terms of saturation. And for me, I find 70 centimeters works nicely. But even with these saturation losses at 70 centimeters and that kind of distance, they're not extreme. They're not extreme. And certainly if you compare to the vertical changes on a TN model like the Dell S2716DG, they're nowhere near as pronounced as that. So I think overall I think it is fair to describe the image that this outputs, the colours, as rich and natural. And I think it's good to also compare it to the older model, the AG352UCG without the 6 at the end. There aren't any dramatic differences with this model, but for what I measured when comparing the units that I tested, this versus my review sample for the older model, there was a slight improvement to the gamma handling. It was slightly closer to the 2.2 curve, slightly less of a sag below that. And the colour gamut was just a touch broader, and there just seems to be something about the colour setup on this model which delivers a slight edge and richness over the older model as well. I'm now on Battlefield 1 again, on one of my favourite scenes for talking about responsiveness, particularly on VA models like this. And this monitor has a 120Hz refresh rate. I'm currently running the game at settings which will yield a 120 frames a second as well as my frame rate. And with this combination of 120Hz, 120 frames a second, the monitor outputs twice as much information as a 60Hz monitor at 60 frames a second. And this gives you a much better connected feel. As you interact with the character and the game world, there's just a sort of connectedness between you and the game world. It translates your movements very quickly, especially when combined with the low input lag of this model. And it's just a big step beyond what you'd find on a 60Hz monitor, even if it had very low input lag. The other aspect of the high refresh rate is that it reduces perceived blur. This is something which is explored in the written review and also an article we've got on responsiveness. It's a fairly complex topic. I mean, I could spend sort of 10 minutes talking about it on this video, but that would be massively boring, and I'm sure you'd prefer to see me just play the game and talk about some other things instead. But essentially, compared to the predecessor of this model, which ran at 100Hz, the extra 20Hz does make a difference to both the connected feel and perceived blur, a positive difference, if you're running a frame rate that takes advantage of that at least. And the other part of the equation when it comes to perceived blur is pixel responsiveness. And for the most part, this monitor actually does very well in that respect. It has very rapid pixel responses in many cases, and that does allow it to really achieve a good low level of perceived blur without sort of obvious interruptions. Usually on VA models, there'd be an obvious smeary trailing behind this horse here. On this model, there is a little bit of what I call breakup trailing. So that's where some shades which are contained in those very dark shades, they appear pretty much black to the eye and probably on the video as well, but during motion some of the colours contained within that shade leach out. For example, there's actually some sort of purplish colours in the horse's tail there, for example, and the back of the horse on its mane. And so there's a little bit of a purple fringe. It's not a bright purple fringe, it's just a slight purple fringe. This is actually reduced compared to the older model, and it's a lot lower than you'd see on most VA models. That's because this monitor uses very effective grey-to-grey acceleration, pixel overdrive. And I'll just quickly show you, if I'm using the medium overdrive setting, which as I explore a bit more in the written review, I feel is optimal. If you lower that to light, which is one setting down from that, this breakup trailing becomes more pronounced. And if you lower it again, I'll give you some better examples of the effect of the overdrive a bit later on, but if you lower that again to weak, it becomes a little more pronounced again, actually quite smeary in its appearance now. And if you lower it again to off, then the breakup trailing becomes very obvious, and there's obvious smearing all over the place. It's not just for this transition, I mean, the whole thing is just, it's like you've got some sort of filter on the game which simulates a drunken person or something like that. It's really not pleasant at all. But anyway, back to the medium setting for now. Oh, and I might as well just show you strong, since I've been playing with these settings. That gives an incredible amount of overshoot. So there's not really smeary trailing there, but instead there's a bright overshoot all around the horse. And every object has a sharp trail around it, and it looks really messy. I mean, look at the moon there. I'm sure that'll come out on the video as well. So definitely avoid the strong setting, but the medium setting. So with the medium setting, for the most part, it's very good. There are some weaknesses. I mean, there are always some weaknesses with VA models. Again, the breakup trailing I showed you with the horse, there are other examples of that. Around this rock here, for example, there's a sort of a purple, slightly bright purple fringe. And there's possibly a bit of overshoot there as well. It's not just breakup trailing in this case. You might be able to see there's also some overshoot around the moon. It sort of depends on your viewing position, because it changes the shades in the sky depending on where you actually view it from. So there's a bit of sort of a dark trail around the moon. But in terms of the breakup trailing, nothing too extreme. And again, there's a bit of sort of breakup trailing on that telegraph post as well. A little bit of sort of overshoot as well around there. Now if I decrease the setting to light, that becomes a lot more pronounced. There's now obvious breakup trailing all around, and it kind of has a fairly unstable look as I move. Same around the rock face there. And if you reduce it further, that becomes even more extreme. And off again. Just absolutely messy. And strong, just don't want to leave strong out. Just massive amount of overshoot everywhere, obvious bright trails, really ugly. So again, medium, optimal. I'm just going to kill these guys, and that will allow me to show you some more examples of the overshoot on this model. And I know people can often get put off when they see overshoot on videos or when it's been discussed. But on this model, it's not extreme with the medium setting. It's definitely there because they do have to apply very strong grey-to-grey acceleration, voltage surges to actually increase the pixel responsiveness enough to get rid of that smeary trailing, and it is replaced with some overshoot in some cases. For example, around the little pistol icons there's a kind of bit of a black overshoot trail, but it doesn't really catch my eye. Sensitivity to overshoot does vary. On this model it's a bit stronger than on one of my main gaming monitors, the Dell S2716DG. It's a bit stronger than you'd see on the BenQ XL series or most of the BenQ XL models if you're familiar with them. So, it is moderate overshoot, but I don't find it too eye-catching and I don't find it distracts me from the gameplay. But as I said, it does annoy some people, and there is a moderate amount of it on this model. But again, if I were to use a weaker setting, which would get rid of that overshoot, so set that to light, which is one down, there's then more obvious smeary trailing. I don't know how it'll look on the video, but I can see obvious smears behind those tools, for example. And that icon as well, the gun icon, sort of smears with a white trail. With the medium setting, there are some weaknesses, not just overshoot. Some pixel responses do appear a little bit slower than optimal, so there's a little bit of what I call powdery trail, but just a light powdery trail. And this is similar to what you get on high refresh rate IPS type models rather than what you typically get on VA models. So overall, the level of perceived blur is a lot lower than you'd expect from a 120Hz VA model. There's moderate overshoot, which annoys some people, and I can't argue with that, it's subjective. But if you don't mind a little bit of overshoot, or moderate amount of overshoot, and you're after a sort of a responsive 120Hz experience, this monitor definitely delivers that. The other aspect is that the monitor supports G-Sync, NVIDIA G-Sync, with a compatible NVIDIA GPU, such as the GTX 1070 I've got on my test system at the moment. Very shortly I'll actually have a GTX 1080 Ti, which of course also supports the technology. But I'll just display the frame rate in the corner there, so 120 frames a second. So all of these things I've been talking about, the connected feel, all of that, it's best at 120 frames a second. Without G-Sync, if the frame rate departs even slightly from that, you get obvious tearing or stuttering. Tearing if you have VSync disabled, and stuttering if you've got VSync enabled. So that's something that people who are sensitive to that really dislike. I really find it very noticeable and distracting. With G-Sync, if the frame rate is reduced slightly, for example, I've increased the settings, it's now around 100 frames a second. It varies, it basically fluctuates quite a bit actually, but it definitely doesn't stay laser focused on 120. That would give me obvious tearing and stuttering if I didn't have G-Sync. With G-Sync, it's a lot smoother, a lot more of a pleasing experience. And as with all aspects of responsiveness, you're not going to be able to see actually how this is in the video. But certainly when you use it firsthand, you can really appreciate this. And sensitivity to tearing and stuttering does vary, so not everyone will find this miraculous, but I certainly very much enjoy having G-Sync. Having said that, as the frame rate reduces, the connected feel does get worse and the perceived blur increases. So G-Sync doesn't get rid of the fact that lower frame rates are still lower frame rates. Reduced frame rates, it sort of more or less averages around 100 frames a second at the moment. You do notice a decrease in connected feel, and you notice an increase in perceived blur. And actually this really sort of hammers home how that extra 20 Hz is beneficial. When you come down from 120 Hz to 100, you can definitely sort of feel the difference and see the difference, or I can at least. And if it drops further, for example, I increase the detail settings more, G-Sync still does its stuff. It gets rid of tearing and stuttering, which is great. It's sort of close to 80 frames a second, but again you get that knockdown and connected feel and an increase in perceived blur. And I could mess around with the settings more and really kill the frame rate. I'll just increase the resolution scale there, that should do it. So G-Sync works. It's just stuttering at the moment because it's just sort of loading my new graphics settings. And now it really does feel very different to how it did at 120 Hz. And this is, it's around 40 frames a second at the moment. There's a huge difference there. And it doesn't feel very nice. But having said that, G-Sync's still doing its thing. It's getting rid of tearing and stuttering. And the lowest refresh rate that G-Sync supports is the same as any G-Sync model, 30 Hz. Below that, it uses a multiple of the frame rate of the game with its refresh rate, and that also combats tearing and stuttering effectively. So it definitely works below 30 frames a second as well, the technology, except as I say, these really low frame rates are just horrendous, and it's a huge waste of the potential of this kind of monitor. Quickly mention, most FreeSync models, when you reduce the refresh rate, so if you've got FreeSync active and your frame rate in the game goes down and the refresh rate of the monitor goes down, the overshoot becomes a lot more pronounced. G-Sync, one of the advantages is that NVIDIA sort of carefully tuned the pixel overdrive, or at least are involved in that process with the monitor manufacturer, to sort of ensure that their pixel responsiveness is tuned to different refresh rates, not just the native highest refresh rate of the monitor. And that reduces overshoot compared to what I see at FreeSync models at these reduced frame rates and refresh rates. But again, there's moderate overshoot anyway on this model, so that's still there, but it is no worse at the lower frame rates and refresh rates. To wrap up then, I think this model is a reasonable upgrade from the older model without the 6 at the end, the AG352UCG. There aren't any massive changes. The changes that they have made I feel are positive. Firstly, there's the fact that the bezels are now matte black instead of glossy black plastic. Doesn't sound like a huge change, but I think it's a positive change. I don't like glossy bezels. They're dust magnets, they're fingerprint magnets. They might look okay when they're very clean, but they start to get annoying quite quickly. And they also reflect light from your room, which isn't very attractive as well. So this monitor, I feel it looks a bit sleeker. Actually the side bezels, the physical bezel area itself, slightly thinner on this model as well. So yeah, I mean, aesthetically, it won't be to everyone's tastes. It isn't the sleekest looking monitor, and it's not incredibly stylish or anything like that, but I find it has a pretty smart look, and yeah, I mean, it's subjective, so you can make your own opinion about that. In terms of the image performance, overall very similar to the older model. The colour gamut is a bit beyond sRGB and very slightly extended beyond the older model, at least with the unit I was testing versus how I was testing the old model. So that gives a bit of an edge of vibrancy compared to a monitor that tracks sRGB more closely. So the image is quite rich. I wouldn't exactly call it vibrant. It's not sort of eye-popping vibrancy because the colour gamut does not extend way beyond sRGB. You know, you don't really get excellent DCI-P3 coverage or anything like that. So it doesn't have the kind of arresting vibrancy that some models might have. The screen surface is nice and light as well, light matte anti-glare, so it's not overly grainy, which is good. It also helps the vibrancy potential compared to stronger matte screen surfaces. The contrast is good. I mean, it's a VA model, you'd expect that. It's not amazing, the contrast. It's for a VA model, it's on the lower end of what you'd expect. It's sort of closer to 2000 to 1 static contrast. So it doesn't have the same sort of inky depth that some VA models have, but it certainly gives you an advantage over non-VA panel types in terms of contrast. There's also a lack of IPS glow, which is nice. There's a bit of VA glow, but nothing extreme, and it's nothing like IPS glow anyway. The colour reproduction, again, the colour gamut, as I've mentioned, is a key feature of that. But the panel type itself, being VA, there are some shifts in gamma, so there's a loss of saturation further out towards the flanks of the screen and the bottom of the screen in particular from a normal viewing position. But these aren't extreme considering the size of the monitor in particular. They're a bit more pronounced than on the Samsung curved SVA panels I've used of this kind of type, this kind of size, sorry. But not extreme, and I don't feel that even at these extremities that the image appears washed out if you're viewing the screen from a reasonable distance. And I like to view it from around 70 centimeters, but it does depend on your own preferences on the desk. It also won't escape your notice that it is a curved screen, and I don't find that a bad thing at all. I just find it slightly draws you into the experience a little bit more, adds to the immersion slightly. I wouldn't say it's ideal for design work or stuff like that, but for general purpose use, it's something you adapt to quite quickly in my experience, and it's not a bad thing at all. The 3440 by 1440 resolution and screen size delivers a good pixel density, very similar to a 27-inch WQHD 2560 by 1440 model. This gives you a decent amount of real estate on the desktop, it gives you a decent amount of detail for images and gaming, that kind of thing. And 21:9 aspect ratio itself gives you some field of view advantages when gaming. It's something which, again, like the Curve, a lot of users will read about and sort of become put off, and they've also got these sort of cognitive biases in their brain. They sort of almost don't want to like these technologies, and then they're sort of almost convincing themselves that it's definitely not for them and they want a 16:9 model instead. But really it's something which, once you use it and you sort of get used to the intricacies, it's actually a very nice thing to have. The responsiveness, that is of course a key difference with the older model. They've ramped the refresh rate up with the overclock enabled in the OSD to 120 Hz over 100 Hz. The panel itself is actually 100 Hz, but the extra 20 Hz is put to good use. It has very effective pixel overdrive or grey-to-grey acceleration, so you do get some overshoot, a moderate amount of overshoot, and I know not all users will like that, but with the medium setting, which I find optimal, it definitely gives you a low level of perceived blur and a good connected feel which goes beyond the older model and indeed beyond this model at 100 Hz, provided you've got the frame rates to match. This monitor also supports NVIDIA G-Sync on compatible GPUs, so it felt right that I should turn the LEDs on at the bottom of the monitor with a green colour as I was talking about this. It's, it worked exactly as I'd expect. It got rid of tearing and stuttering as the frame rate departed from the refresh rate. I didn't like low frame rates, I never like low frame rates compared to higher frame rates even with G-Sync enabled, but it is certainly nice to have the tearing and stuttering from the refresh rate and frame rate mismatches gone from the equation. There were no specific weaknesses when using G-Sync on this model which I haven't observed on other models using the variable refresh rate technology. For example, sometimes you get a bit of flickering where the frame rate goes very low and the animations essentially pause, for example in cutscenes in some games and sometimes on some menu systems. But actually during the game, when you're at decent frame rates and just generally during gameplay, no problems like that. So overall, I would consider this to be a competent gaming monitor. I like the changes they've made from the old monitor. It's not really a monitor for you if you're particularly sensitive to overshoot. It's also not a monitor for you if you're after a super vibrant image. But if you're happy with a rich and natural look to the image, with a little bit of vividness here and there, and you don't mind moderate overshoot, then this monitor is definitely a good one to consider. So that about wraps it up. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that and information about how you can support the work that we do in the description of the video.